Imagine a structure so vast it could stretch from London to Constantinople, a barrier so dense a wolf could not squeeze through its midsection, and a fortification so bizarre it was built not of granite, steel, or brick, but of living, breathing, stinging thorns. History is often written in the permanence of stone, yet the most ambitious engineering project of the British Raj has almost entirely vanished from the earth, reclaimed by the very soil it was meant to divide. This was the inland customs line, known more colloquially and with a touch of Victorian awe as the Great Hedge of India. At its peak, it was a 12-foot-high wall of vegetation stretching nearly 2,500 miles across the Indian subcontinent. It was not built to keep out invading armies or to mark the borders of a kingdom. It was built for a single, mundane, and essential mineral: salt. To understand why the most powerful empire on the planet would spend decades planting a desert-spanning thicket of prickly pear and plum trees, one must first understand the biological and economic desperation that salt represents. In the sweltering humidity of the Indian plains, salt is not a culinary luxury, it is a physiological requirement for survival. A human body in that heat loses salt through sweat at a rate that can lead to cramping, exhaustion, and death if not replenished. The British East India Company, having transitioned from a group of mere merchants to the de facto rulers of a continent, realized that they held a monopoly on the very breath and blood of the population. By taxing salt, they could extract revenue from every single person, from the wealthiest Maharaja to the poorest peasant, because no one could simply choose not to consume it. The geography of salt in India is a story of extremes. It was harvested from the massive, shimmering salt flats of the Rann of Kutch in the west, evaporated from the brine of the Sambar Lake in the arid heart of Rajasthan, and gathered from the coastal pans of the Bay of Bengal in the east. However, the British faced a problem of logistics and leakage. Each region had different tax rates, and the company's territory was a patchwork of direct rule and allied princely states. Salt smuggled from low-tax areas into high-tax areas represented a massive loss for the colonial coffers. In the early 19th century, the British decided that if they could not control the production of salt everywhere, they would instead build a cage around the regions they did control. They established a customs line, a series of checkpoints along major roads. But India is a land of infinite paths, and smugglers simply walked through the forests and fields to bypass the collectors. The solution proposed by the bureaucratic mind was as simple as it was insane. They would build a fence. Not a fence of wood, which would rot in the monsoon rains or be eaten by termites, but a fence that would grow. By the 1840s, this customs line had begun to mutate into a singular, continuous entity. It started as a dry hedge, a massive pile of cut thorny bushes and branches dragged into a long linear mound. This was the precursor to the living wall. Imagine the labor involved in this initial phase. Thousands of local workers were pressed into service, hacking away at the scrub of the jungle to create a dead, tangled barrier. But a dry hedge is a temporary thing. It burns easily, it decays, and windstorms can scatter it across the plains. The British realized that to truly seal the border, they needed the barrier to be alive. They began a systematic botanical campaign to plant a green hedge that would be impenetrable to man and beast alike. The species were chosen for their hostility. They favored the Ziziphus jujube, the Indian plum, which carries sharp, hooked thorns, the Carissa corandus, a dense shrub that creates a literal wall of spikes, and various species of euphorbia and prickly pear cactus. In areas where the soil was too sandy or the air too dry for these, they planted thickets of bamboo or raised massive embankments of earth. This was not a mere garden project. It was a paramilitary operation. The line was divided into sections, each overseen by European officers who lived in lonely, heat-blasted bungalows along the route. Under them were the chowkidars, the Indian customs guards. At the height of the hedge's existence, there were approximately 12,000 men employed to patrol its length. Every few hundred yards there was a post. Every mile there was a larger station. The guards were tasked with maintaining the perfect state of the hedge. They had to ensure there were no gaps, no rat holes, where a nimble smuggler might slide a bag of salt through the thorns. If a section of the hedge died due to drought or disease, it had to be replaced immediately. If a fire broke out, the alarm was raised across the plains. The hedge became a sentient, growing bureaucracy, consuming vast amounts of water, labor, and administrative focus. The scale of the line was staggering. It began in the northern foothills of the Himalayas near the Indus River, and snaked its way southward and eastward, cutting through the heart of the subcontinent, eventually reaching the Mahanadi River in the east. It was a scar across the landscape that dictated the flow of life for millions. For the British, it was a triumph of order over the perceived chaos of the Indian wilderness. To the local populations, it was a monstrous imposition. A farmer whose family had grazed cattle on a certain hill for generations might wake up to find a wall of thorns blocking his path. A trader who once moved freely between villages now had to travel 20 miles out of his way to find a legal gate or opening in the line, where he would be subjected to the scrutiny and often the corruption of the customs officials. The hedge did not just stop salt, it stopped movement, it stopped communication, and fostered a deep-seated resentment that simmered beneath the surface of the Raj. The British obsession with the hedge reached its peak under the administration of Allan Octavian Hume, a man who would later become famous as one of the founders of the Indian National Congress, but who in the 1860s was the Commissioner of Inland Customs. Hume was a man of intense energy and scientific curiosity. He viewed the hedge not just as a fiscal tool, but as a botanical challenge. He issued meticulous reports on the health of the bushes, the density of the thorns, and the efficiency of the guards. He fretted over the permeability of certain sections, and experimented with different species of vines to lace the hedge together into a singular, unbreakable fabric. Under his watch, the hedge became more than a barrier. It became a masterpiece of colonial madness. It was a physical manifestation of the desire to quantify and control a land that was fundamentally too large and too diverse to be held in such a manner. As the sun set over the plains of central India in the mid-19th century, the Great Hedge cast a long, jagged shadow. To a bird flying above, it would have looked like a dark green serpent winding through the golden dust of the landscape. It was a monument to the power of a tax, a living testament to the lengths an empire would go to secure its revenue. But a wall made of life is subject to the whims of nature. It requires constant, exhausting vigilance to prevent it from either dying or growing out of control. The very thorns that kept the smugglers out also made the hedge a nightmare to prune and maintain. It was a stalemate between the British will and the Indian soil, a multi-thousand-mile-long battleground where the weapons were watering cans, pruning shears, and the relentless, unforgiving sun. The Great Hedge was at its zenith, a biological wonder of the world, yet the seeds of its own absurdity were already beginning to sprout, threatening to turn this grand achievement into one of history's most forgotten follies.
At the heart of this botanical madness sat the Inland Customs Department, a bureaucratic entity that functioned less like a government office and more like a paramilitary landscaping firm. Their primary objective was the enforcement of the salt tax, but their daily reality was a relentless war against the reproductive cycles of tropical flora. To maintain the line, as it was simply called, the British employed an army of nearly 12,000 men. This was the Salt Line Force, a hierarchy of commissioners, collectors, patrol officers, and peons, all dedicated to the preservation of a singular, prickly boundary. Their leader, the man who would eventually become the architect of the hedge's most ambitious phase, was Allan Octavian Hume. Hume was a man of intense contradictions, a scientist, an ornithologist, and a meticulous administrator who would one day help found the Indian National Congress. But in the 1860s, his mind was occupied by the density of thorns and the spacing of seedlings. Hume realized that the existing dry hedge, a collection of cut, dead branches piled high, was a failure. It was prone to rot, it was easily burned by smugglers, and it required constant replacement. He envisioned something more permanent, a living hedge that would grow into an impenetrable thicket. This was not merely a matter of planting a few bushes, it was an engineering project of continental proportions. Hume's men were tasked with clearing a strip of land, digging deep trenches to provide irrigation, and selecting the most hostile species of plants the Indian subcontinent had to offer. They settled on a cocktail of botanical terrors: the Indian plum, the prickly pear, the Carissa corondus, and the babool tree. These were not chosen for their beauty, but for their ability to interlace their branches and present a wall of serrated edges to anyone attempting to cross. The technical specifications for the hedge were as rigid as a military manual. In its ideal state, the Great Hedge was to be at least 10 feet high and 6 to 12 feet thick. It had to be so dense that even a small animal could not squeeze through without shedding fur. But nature does not always follow government regulations. In the arid regions of the Northwest, the plants struggled to find moisture, requiring the construction of elaborate water-carrying networks where men hauled buckets across miles of sun-cracked earth. In the more humid regions, the hedge grew with such feral intensity that it threatened to swallow the very patrol paths the guards used. The salt men found themselves in a paradoxical struggle. They were simultaneously fighting to keep the hedge alive and fighting to keep it from becoming a chaotic, unmanageable jungle. For the low-ranking chowkidars, sentries who walked the line, life was a cycle of profound boredom punctuated by moments of extreme physical labor. Each man was responsible for a specific section of the hedge, and his performance was judged by the tightness of his greenery. If a gap appeared, whether through disease, the nibbling of a goat, or the secret shears of a smuggler, it was a personal failing. They spent their days weaving young saplings into the existing structure, a process known as plashing, which ensured that the hedge was not just a row of trees, but a single unified organism. They were the weavers of a 2,500-mile-long basket, one that could cut your hands to ribbons if you weren't careful. But the smugglers were just as ingenious as the British were obsessive. The salt tax was a heavy burden on the poor, often representing several weeks' wages for a single bag of the essential mineral. This created a powerful economic incentive to bypass the line. Smugglers developed a repertoire of tactics that would have been comedic if the stakes weren't so high. Some would wait for the cover of a monsoon downpour, when the visibility was zero and the guards were huddled under makeshift shelters, to hack a quick hole through the thorns. Others practiced the art of the salt toss. A group would gather on the western side of the hedge and literally hurl heavy bags of salt over the 10-foot-high canopy to Confederates waiting on the eastern side. It was a high-stakes game of catch played across a wall of knives. Then there were the salt shoes. Smugglers would construct footwear with thick, hollow soles filled with illicit salt, hoping that a casual stroll across a checkpoint would go unnoticed. Others trained camels to kneel and crawl through drainage culverts, or used the very bullocks that pulled the government's own supply wagons to hide extra pouches of salt within their harness gear. The hedge was a physical barrier, yes, but it was also a test of human creativity. Every time the Inland Customs Department added a new layer of thorns, the smugglers found a new way to go under, over, or through them. The logistics of the line also had to account for the geography of India itself. The hedge didn't just sit on flat plains. It had to navigate riverbeds, rocky outcrops, and shifting sands. Where the hedge met a river, the British couldn't simply plant bushes in the water. Instead, they employed river guards and rowboats and constructed elaborate floating barriers made of spiked timber. In the ravines of the Yamuna River, the hedge had to be anchored into steep cliffsides, a task that required the guards to dangle from ropes while planting thorny acacias. It was a monumental expenditure of effort for a goal that felt increasingly abstract. To the men on the ground, they weren't defending an empire. They were nursing a very long, very cranky shrub. By the late 1860s, the cost of maintaining this biological wall was becoming a point of contention in the colonial capital of Calcutta. The Inland Customs Department was consuming a staggering percentage of the revenue it collected just to keep the hedge from falling apart. Hume, ever the optimist, argued that the hedge was an investment. Once it reached maturity, he claimed, it would be self-sustaining, a permanent sentinel that required no salary. But the maturity of the hedge brought its own problems. Large sections of the line became infested with locusts or decimated by fungal blights. In 1871, a particularly devastating drought killed off miles of the prickly pear sections, leaving gaping holes that had to be plugged with the old inferior dry hedge until new seeds could take root. Furthermore, the hedge was creating its own microenvironment. The dense thicket became a sanctuary for snakes, leopards, and wolves, making the nightly patrols of the chowkidars a genuinely life-threatening endeavor. A guard might be searching for a salt thief only to stumble upon a cobra nesting in the cool shade of the babool roots. The boring history of the hedge is punctuated by these quiet tragedies, men lost to the elements or the wildlife, all in the name of ensuring that a peasant in Bihar paid a few extra copper coins for his seasoning. Despite these setbacks, the Great Hedge reached its absolute peak in the early 1870s. It was the most significant man-made barrier in the world, longer than the Great Wall of China and far more demanding of daily attention. It stood as a physical manifestation of the British obsession with order and classification. Every mile was mapped, every officer station was logged, and every seedling was accounted for in the ledgers of Calcutta. The zenith had arrived, but its end was now finally near.
The man responsible for this peak, for this strange horticultural triumph, was Alan Octavian Hume. History remembers Hume primarily as one of the founding members of the Indian National Congress, a man who eventually championed Indian self-determination. Yet in the late 1860s and early 1870s, he was the Commissioner of Inland Customs, and his primary obsession was the absolute integrity of the Great Hedge. Hume was a man of staggering administrative energy and a fanatic for detail. He was also a passionate ornithologist, a man who could identify 1,000 species of birds by their song alone, yet he spent his most productive years perfecting a barrier designed to trap humans and their seasonings. Under his tenure, the Inland Customs line was transformed from a disorganized collection of saplings and dry brush into a standardized, formidable machine of state revenue. Hume recognized that a barrier is only as strong as its weakest mile. He instituted a rigorous system of classification for the hedge, dividing it into sections based on the quality of the growth. A perfect hedge in Hume's ledgers was one that was at least 12 feet high and 14 feet thick, so densely intertwined that a small dog could not squeeze through the thorns. Where the soil was too rocky or the climate too arid for the living hedge to take root, he ordered the construction of the dry hedge. This was a massive embankment of dead, thorny branches, hauled in by the ton and piled high, then lashed together with vines to prevent the wind from scattering the defense. These dry sections required constant replacement, as the blistering sun and the seasonal monsoons rotted the wood or turned it into a tinderbox. The logistics of maintaining even a few miles of dry hedge were immense, requiring a constant stream of bullock carts laden with thorny scrub. Yet Hume demanded this happen across hundreds of miles of the Indian interior. The sheer scale of the operation was, in the most literal sense, a boring marvel of bureaucracy. By 1872, the customs line employed over 12,000 men. This small army was organized with military precision. There were commissioners, collectors, patrolmen, and the lowest tier of the hierarchy, the chowkidars or guards. These men were stationed at intervals of roughly 1 mile, living in small, lonely huts along the line. Every night they were required to patrol their beat, carrying lanterns and heavy bamboo sticks called lathis. Their job was to listen for the sound of breaking branches, or the hushed whispers of smugglers. At every mile there was a small gate or a customs post where legal trade was permitted to pass, provided the heavy duty was paid. These posts were the only breaks in a wall that stretched from the Indus River in the northwest to the Mahanadi in the southeast, effectively slicing the subcontinent in two. To the British, the hedge was a triumph of order over the perceived chaos of the Indian landscape. To the local population, however, it was a source of profound, quiet misery. Salt is not a luxury in the humid heat of India. It is a physiological necessity. For a laborer working 10 hours a day in the fields, salt is the difference between health and a slow, agonizing decline into muscle cramps, exhaustion, and death. By placing a tax on salt that often amounted to several weeks' wages for a poor family, the British were essentially taxing the breath in their lungs. This created a desperate class of salt runners, smugglers who risked everything to move a few pounds of salt across the line. These were not the romanticized outlaws of European tradition. They were usually destitute peasants who knew every fold of the land. The methods of smuggling became increasingly ingenious as the hedge grew thicker. Some would attempt to throw small bags of salt over the thorns at night, hoping a Confederate on the other side would find them in the dark. Others would wait for the heavy rains of the monsoon, when the dry hedge might sag or the chowkidars would seek shelter from the downpour. There are records of smugglers attempting to train dogs to carry small pouches of salt through the undergrowth, or of women hiding salt in the hollowed-out frames of their bullock carts. Hume and his officers responded with even greater vigilance. They cleared strips of land on either side of the hedge, hundreds of yards wide, to ensure that anyone approaching the barrier would be visible from a distance. This created a bizarre, artificial scar across the landscape: a strip of scorched earth, a towering wall of thorns, and another strip of scorched earth, all patrolled by men in khaki. The internal life of the inland customs line was defined by a specific kind of colonial boredom. The officers, mostly young British men seeking to make their mark, found themselves stationed in some of the most remote and inhospitable corners of the empire. Their letters home are filled with complaints about the heat, the dust, and the crushing loneliness of the hedge. They spent their days filling out endless forms, reports on the height of the babool trees, the number of thorns per square inch, and the health of the patrolmen. They lived in a world of ledgers and thorns, where the highlight of a month might be the discovery of a new species of lizard, or a slightly higher than average revenue report from a local gate. This was the reality of empire building, not the grand battles of the history books, but the slow, methodical maintenance of a shrubbery. However, as the 1870s progressed, the cracks in the Great Hedge began to show, not in the plants themselves, but in the logic of the system. The arrival of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway began to make the hedge look like a relic of a bygone age. It was one thing to patrol a footpath. It was quite another to stop a steam engine. As the rail lines began to crisscross India, the British realized they could collect the salt tax more efficiently at the points of production, the salt pans of the coast and the mines of the Punjab, rather than trying to catch individual smugglers in the middle of a forest. The economic justification for the hedge, which had always been tenuous, began to collapse under the weight of its own administrative costs. The 12,000 men on the line cost nearly as much to maintain as the tax they collected. Moreover, the moral weight of the hedge was becoming impossible to ignore, even for the most hardened imperialists. In 1876, a catastrophic famine struck southern India. As millions faced starvation, the presence of a 2,500-mile barrier that inhibited the movement of goods and artificially inflated the price of a basic necessity became a scandal. Critics in London and Calcutta began to point out the absurdity of a civilizing mission that relied on a wall of thorns to squeeze pennies from the dying. Lord Lytton, the Viceroy of India, despite his often criticized handling of the famine, realized that the inland customs line was a diplomatic and logistical nightmare. He began to listen to the reformers who argued for a unified salt tax that would eliminate the need for an internal border. The decline was signaled by a change in tone in the official reports. Where Hume had once written with pride about the impenetrable density of the barrier, later inspectors began to describe it as a monstrous nuisance. The hedge had become a symbol of everything wrong with the East India Company's legacy, a rigid, expensive, and ultimately futile attempt to control a land that was too vast and too complex to be hemmed in by plum trees. By 1878, the decision was made. The Great Hedge, the longest man-made barrier in the world, was to be dismantled. The process was not an explosion, but a slow, bureaucratic unwinding. The guards were reassigned, the gates were left open, and the thousands of miles of thorns were left to the mercy of the Indian sun. The zenith had passed, and the silence of the jungle began to reclaim the line.
The process was not an explosion, but a slow, bureaucratic unwinding. The guards were reassigned, the gates were left open, and the thousands of miles of thorns were left to the mercy of the Indian sun. The zenith had passed, and the silence of the jungle began to reclaim the line. It was an ending defined by the scratching of pens rather than the clashing of swords. On the 1st of April 1879, the inland customs line was officially abolished. The transition was managed with the same fastidious attention to detail that had characterized its construction. The 12,000 men who had patrolled the barrier were not simply dismissed. They were absorbed back into the massive machinery of the British Raj. Some were moved to the coastal saltworks, others to the police forces of the burgeoning cities, and many simply vanished back into the agrarian landscape from which they had been recruited. The physical structures, the stone gatehouses, the wooden huts, and the customs posts were stripped of anything of value. Hinges were unbolted, roofs were salvaged for timber, and the official records were packed into crates to be stored in the damp basements of Calcutta and London, where they would wait for a century to be rediscovered. As the human presence evaporated, the hedge began its second life as a feral entity. Without the constant pruning, weaving, and staking performed by the customs peons, the Great Hedge lost its structural integrity. The ziziphus and carissa bushes, no longer forced into a vertical wall of impenetrable density, began to sprawl outward. In the fertile regions, the hedge became a choked thicket, a chaotic tangle of thorns that provided sanctuary for jackals and cobras. In the more arid stretches of the United Provinces, the lack of human-maintained irrigation meant the hedge began to wither. The Indian sun, which the hedge had once shaded with its dark green leaves, now baked the unmaintained earth around its roots. The botanical barrier, once a singular, cohesive organism stretching across a continent, fragmented into thousands of isolated patches of scrub. The local populations who had lived for generations under the shadow of the thorns were the first to reclaim the land. Farmers who had long looked at the 100-foot-wide customs strip as a waste of arable soil began to encroach. They did not do it all at once, for the fear of the company's ghost still lingered, but year by year the plow pushed closer to the center of the line. The thorns were hacked away for firewood, a precious commodity in the plains. The dry, brittle branches burned with a fierce, crackling heat, providing warmth for the very villagers who had once been forced to pay exorbitant prices for the salt the hedge protected. In this way, the Great Hedge was slowly consumed by the people it had been built to exclude. By the turn of the century, the Great Wall of India had largely disappeared from the physical map, replaced by fields of wheat, mustard, and sugarcane. Perhaps more remarkable than its physical disappearance was its erasure from the historical record. The British, usually so meticulous in documenting their colonial triumphs, seemed to develop a collective amnesia regarding the inland customs line. It was a project that did not fit the narrative of this civilizing mission. There were no grand cathedrals built here, no railways that could be lauded as gifts of modernization. The hedge was a blunt instrument of extraction, a monument to a regressive tax that had burdened the poorest subjects of the empire. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the hedge was scrubbed from the textbooks. The maps were redrawn with a thick, shaded line that had once bisected the subcontinent. To the new generation of colonial administrators, the hedge was an embarrassment, a relic of a crude mercantilist past that the sophisticated Raj preferred to forget. For over 100 years, the Great Hedge of India existed only as a ghost in the archives. It was a footnote in the memoirs of retired commissioners, a strange curiosity mentioned in passing by historians of the salt trade. It seemed destined to be lost forever until 1995, when Roy Moxham, an archivist of the University of London, stumbled upon a mention of it in a dusty volume of Rambles and Recollections of an Indian Official by W. H. Sleeman. Moxham was struck by the sheer scale of the description, a 2,500-mile barrier of thorns. To a modern sensibility, it sounded like a myth, a piece of folklore that had been mistaken for history. He began a journey that was part academic research and part physical odyssey, attempting to find any surviving trace of the structure. Moxham's search was initially met with bafflement. In the libraries of Delhi and the administrative offices of the modern Indian government, the Great Hedge was unknown. The local villagers he interviewed along the historical route had no memory of a Great Wall of Thorns. They knew of the old salt roads, and they knew of the ancient ruins of forts, but a hedge that spanned the country seemed like a traveler's tall tale. It was only through the careful study of the 19th century revenue maps, the boring history of land surveys and tax plots, that Moxham was able to pinpoint the exact coordinates where the hedge had once stood. The breakthrough occurred in the state of Uttar Pradesh, near the small village of Lehram. There, Moxham found something that the jungle and the plow had failed to erase. It was not a hedge of thorns, but an embankment, a raised earthen berm that stretched across the landscape, cutting through fields and disappearing into the distance. This was the foundation upon which the hedge had been planted, the literal ground of the customs line. Upon closer inspection, the embankment was still populated by the descendants of the original plants. Thickets of ziziphus and carissa still grew in a straight, unnatural line, their thorns just as sharp and their wood just as dense as those described by Alan Octavian Hume in the 1870s. Standing on that embankment, one can finally perceive the true nature of the Great Hedge. It was not merely a wall, but a psychological boundary. It was the physical manifestation of an ideology that viewed a nation as a series of balance sheets and its people as sources of revenue. The hedge was the ultimate expression of the boring history of bureaucracy taken to its most absurd and terrifying extreme. It was a masterpiece of logistics, a triumph of botanical engineering, and a moral catastrophe. It was a structure that required the labor of tens of thousands to build and the misery of millions to maintain, yet it was so fragile that it could be unmade by a single act of legislation and a few decades of neglect. Today, the Great Hedge of India remains a footnote, a curious anomaly in the grand narrative of human history. It serves as a reminder that the most monumental efforts of man are often the most ephemeral. The Great Wall of China was built of stone and survives as a testament to empire. The Great Hedge of India was built of living things and survives only as a whisper in the soil. It is a story of how a line on a map became a wall of thorns, and how a wall of thorns became a memory, and how a memory was eventually reclaimed by the earth. As the sun sets over the plains of India, the shadows of the remaining thickets stretch long across the fields. To the casual observer, they are nothing more than common scrub, the unremarkable vegetation of the roadside. But to those who know the history, they are the last sentinels of a forgotten border. The thorns still prick the fingers of the curious, a sharp physical reminder of a time when the world was divided by a green wall of greed and salt. The silence of the jungle, which began in 1879, is now complete. The Great Hedge is gone, leaving behind only the boring, beautiful, and vast expanse of a land that refused to be hemmed in.